When my son handed me a folder of documents and said, "Mom, just sign it. It's just a formality," I felt a sting. Something was off. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He was in a hurry. He was used to me not asking questions. And once, maybe, I would have signed. But not this time. I opened the folder. I understood. And then I did the one thing he never expected. I signed everything. But not to him, to myself. This time, it wasn't naivety. It was payback. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Marilyn Stewart. I was 72 years old, retired for nearly a decade, and living alone in the same house I had shared with my husband until the day he passed. We bought it back in 1985, a modest two-story with a wraparound porch and a backyard large enough to host birthdays, barbecues, and years of autumn leaf piles. It sat just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, in a quiet neighborhood lined with oaks and American flags, where everyone still waved at their neighbors whether they knew them or not. Before retirement, I had spent 35 years working as a bookkeeper at a small family-owned logistics firm. I wasn't flashy, and I didn't like surprises. I liked neat columns, itemized receipts, balanced ledgers. Numbers made sense to me in ways people sometimes didn't. They never lied. They never changed stories. They added up, or they didn't. After my husband died, I filled my days with structure. I woke up at 6:30 every morning, whether I had a reason to or not. I made coffee in the same pot I'd used since 1994, read a chapter of whatever paperback I was working through, and watered my garden before the sun got too high. I tracked expenses, cleaned baseboards, and wrote out my grocery list by hand on a yellow notepad with squared-off letters and a black gel pen. It wasn't because I feared disorder. It was because I found peace in it, a kind of invisible calm that kept the grief from pooling in the corners of the house. I didn't have many visitors, and I didn't mind. I enjoyed the stillness. I liked the click of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the creak of the floorboard near the stove, the small rhythm of a home that knew me. I didn't get lonely, not exactly. I had my volunteer work at the church office, the occasional potluck on Sundays, and a bi-weekly coffee group at the library with other women who had long since stopped pretending life was supposed to be exciting. It was supposed to be safe. My son Josh called once a week, sometimes twice if he needed something. He was 42, married with 2 children and a career in real estate that seemed to bounce between ambition and chaos. We were not close, but we were polite. He had always been more like his father, pragmatic, ambitious, a little impatient. He talked fast, moved fast, and always had a plan. I loved him deeply, but I often felt like I was holding on to the back of his coat, hoping he wouldn't forget I was there. I had helped him financially more times than I could count. First, when he opened his first office and needed someone to co-sign the lease. Later, when he and his wife wanted a down payment for their new house. Then again, when one of the kids needed surgery and the insurance fell short. Each time, I said yes, not because I didn't have boundaries, but because I wanted to believe in his intentions. Because I had always taught him that family meant showing up, and I had always shown up. But something had shifted recently. He had started stopping by more often than usual, showing up with coffee and polite questions about how I was managing things around the house. He asked about bills, about my will, about what I had in place in case anything happened. I told myself it was care, just concern. But deep down, something felt different. His visits felt rehearsed, his compliments unnatural. And he always brought up paperwork. One morning, as I was dusting the living room shelves, I realized just how many things I had kept exactly the same. The photo albums, the crocheted blankets, the receipts tucked into labeled envelopes, the ceramic plate from our 30th anniversary still displayed above the mantel. Everything had a place. Everything told a story. But I began to wonder if anyone left in my life remembered those stories but me. The thought made me pause. I pulled out the file cabinet from my closet and began to sort through old documents, titles, tax returns, insurance policies. It was a system I had built over years, categorized in neat manila folders. I updated what needed updating. I took inventory. I wanted to be prepared. I had always believed that preparing was a kindness to yourself and to the people you might leave behind. That afternoon, I sat on the back porch and watched the wind move through the trees. It was warm for fall. The leaves hadn't turned yet, but the air had shifted. Crisper, more honest. I sipped my tea and thought about the last conversation I had with Josh. He had asked again about the house, said something about streamlining the process and reducing legal messes down the line. I nodded at the time. I didn't argue, but the truth had lodged itself under my ribs like a splinter. He wanted me to trust him, and for most of my life, I had. But I knew the difference between a helping hand and a hidden agenda. I had seen enough spreadsheets in my life to recognize when the numbers didn't add up, and something in his behavior wasn't adding up. That night, I sharpened a pencil and pulled out a clean sheet of paper from my drawer. I wrote at the top, "What belongs to me?" And beneath it, I began to list everything. Not just the house and the savings, but the time, the effort, the memories, the work, the decisions, the life I had built in this house, brick by brick, choice by choice. I stared at that list for a long time, and then I picked up the phone and made an appointment with a lawyer, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood that love, even the kind you feel for your own child, does not mean surrender. Not this time. It was a Saturday afternoon when he came by, unannounced but not entirely unexpected. I had been folding towels in the laundry room, humming something under my breath that I couldn't quite place. I heard his car pull into the driveway and the sound of the front door opening with that overly familiar creak. He had a key, of course. He always had a key. It was something I had given him years ago when Ted passed away, back when trust still felt like something safe to hand over. He called out from the hallway, light and cheerful, the way he always did when he wanted something. I met him in the kitchen. He was holding a to-go coffee in each hand and a manila folder tucked under one arm. His smile was wide, a bit too polished. I noticed his eyes didn't linger on mine. Instead, he scanned the kitchen as though checking for someone else. He handed me the coffee, set the folder on the kitchen table, and started talking almost immediately. Fast, confident, persuasive. He was always like that when he had a pitch. He said he'd spoken to someone he trusted about simplifying things, that it would be better for all of us to get ahead of the paperwork now. The word streamline floated around a lot. He said he wanted to protect me from future confusion, make sure things were clear just in case. Every phrase was delivered with careful polish, designed to soothe. I stood there, cup in hand, nodding occasionally. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. His voice never faltered, but something in me did. He slid the folder across the table, opened it, and pointed to a few highlighted sections. Pages and pages of documents, contracts, notarized forms, and what he described as a simple transfer. He said I just needed to sign here and here and here. A few initials, nothing complicated. I looked down at the documents, then up at him. His eyes darted. He was already reaching into his pocket for a pen. I didn't move. He asked if I had any questions, but he didn't leave space for any answers. He kept talking, covering ground quickly, as if words could outrun whatever questions might rise. He mentioned how busy things had been with the kids, the market, the mortgage, how much easier it would be for me if he handled the technical stuff. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. I picked up the folder and flipped through it slowly. I didn't understand every word, but I knew enough. I saw the title of the house. I saw my name, and then I saw it crossed over. I saw phrases like power of attorney, exclusive authority, and full control. I didn't speak. My silence seemed to make him nervous, though he tried not to show it. He took a sip of his coffee and cleared his throat. I set the folder back down and said I would need time to read through everything carefully. He hesitated, just for a moment, but then nodded too quickly, too eagerly. He said, of course, no rush, but that it would be good to have everything wrapped up soon. Better for everyone, he said, brushing a crumb off the table that wasn't there. Then he stood, pressed a kiss to the top of my head, and said he'd check back in a few days. His voice was light again, but his shoulders were too straight, too tense. He walked out the door without waiting for me to follow him. I stood by the kitchen table long after the sound of his car disappeared. The house felt different after he left, quieter, but not in the peaceful way I'd grown used to. It was the kind of silence that hums with unfinished questions. I made another cup of coffee, though I hadn't finished the first, and sat at the table staring at the folder. My hands were steady, but my chest was not. I knew what this was. I had seen it before, in other families, in other people's stories. Sons and daughters who moved faster than love, who asked for trust and delivered expectation, who dressed their ambition in concern. But this was my home, my life, my name on those deeds. I had spent years tending this place, watering the soil, fixing the porch, paying every bill on time, patching holes in both the walls and the people who lived within them. I had given, and now I was being asked to surrender. I opened the folder again, this time with a pen in my hand, not to sign, but to mark. I circled, I underlined, I flagged sections with sticky notes from the drawer. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't about my well-being. This was about access, about assumption, about someone who thought I wouldn't look closely. But I did. I read until the sun slipped behind the trees, until the shadows stretched across the tile floor, until the porch light came on automatically. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text. I just read and reread and quietly decided. By the time I closed the folder, I wasn't uncertain anymore. My breath had slowed. My mind had sharpened. I stood up, placed the folder on the edge of the table, and walked to the window. The yard outside was still, the air heavy with late summer. A single moth bumped against the glass. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a while. And then I picked up the phone, not to call him, but to schedule an appointment with a lawyer. I spent the next 3 days reading every page in that folder like it held the code to my future. Because in a way, it did. I took my time, breaking each section down piece by piece, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a highlighter. The papers didn't scream betrayal. They didn't need to. The betrayal was in the silence, in what wasn't said aloud, in what was buried beneath layers of legal language that assumed I'd be too old or too tired to question any of it. It wasn't just a transfer of property. It was a quiet handoff of power. My home, my savings, my medical decisions, even my ability to sign for myself. All of it tied neatly together in what Josh had called standard paperwork. Power of attorney, yes, but not the kind that offered help, the kind that replaced me. And the deed transfer? It wasn't for management. It was for ownership. My son, in black and white, was positioning himself not as my guardian, but as my successor, while I was still very much alive. I went through each document more than once. I took notes, flagged terms I didn't understand, looked up legal definitions online late into the night. Words like irrevocable, exclusive authority, and sole beneficiary took on new weight when viewed through the lens of someone else's quiet convenience. Every sentence seemed written to gently erase me, and yet the language was polite, professional, sanitized. It didn't feel malicious on the surface. It felt procedural, which somehow made it worse, like I had become an estate before I had even stopped breathing. Like my presence was now a placeholder for a transaction that only needed my signature to finalize. I thought a lot about Josh during those hours, about who he had become, about the man I remembered raising, about the moments where the shift began. I recalled him as a teenager, already negotiating with the confidence of a grown man, asking for a later curfew, for loaned money, for freedom without accountability. Back then, I'd laughed it off, called it charm. I told myself he was just ambitious, a born leader. But now I saw something else layered beneath that ambition, a sense of entitlement that had slowly grown roots. I remembered the last time we talked about the house in any serious way. It was a few years ago, during a family dinner. I had mentioned casually that I planned to age in place, that I didn't see myself leaving the house unless absolutely necessary. He had chuckled and said something like, "Well, just don't forget to leave the paperwork behind when the time comes." We had all laughed, even me. I hadn't thought about it again until now. Now that line echoed back in a different tone. As I studied the forms, I started to think not just about what he wanted from me, but why I had allowed so many small decisions to pass without question. The little favors, the signatures, the just this one time requests. I had treated them as part of motherhood, part of love, part of what we do when we're needed. But love isn't the absence of boundaries, and I had let mine erode slowly, year by year, until this moment didn't feel like a theft. It felt like the natural conclusion. That realization brought something unexpected with it. Anger, not a rage, not a burning fire. No, this anger was cold, controlled, a quiet steel beneath my skin that hadn't been there before. I wasn't furious at Josh. I was furious at myself for shrinking, for making excuses, for not speaking up sooner, for forgetting that I had a right to protect what I built. That night, I pulled out my own documents, the ones I had filed away years ago, the deed to the house, my will, the old power of attorney form I had filled out when my husband was still alive. Everything had dust on it. Everything had been untouched too long. I placed them side by side with the folder Josh had left. Two versions of my life, one written by my hand, one rewritten by his. I opened a clean notebook and wrote in large block letters, "Not yet." Then underneath that, "I am not done." I called the law office the next morning and scheduled a consultation. I asked to speak with someone who specialized in elder law and estate protection. I didn't explain everything over the phone. I just said, "I need to make sure what's mine stays mine." The woman on the other end paused, then said, "Of course, ma'am. We'll take good care of you." I believed her. That afternoon, I placed Josh's folder back in the drawer, but moved it to the bottom. It no longer intimidated me. I knew exactly what it was, not a threat, not a trap, just a plan made without me, a plan I was no longer obligated to honor. And as I sat back down at the table with a fresh cup of tea, I realized something else. This wasn't just about protecting what I had. It was about remembering who I was, not someone's future inheritance, not someone's paperwork to manage, but a whole, breathing, thinking woman who had given too much of her voice away. Now I was taking it back, one signature at a time. The law office was smaller than I remembered. It had been over 20 years since I last walked through those glass doors, back when Ted and I had drawn up our original will and designated each other as beneficiaries and executors. Back then, we hadn't thought much beyond each other. Our son had still been young, and the future had seemed solid, predictable, something that would unfold naturally without interference. Now the receptionist was someone new, young enough to be my granddaughter, with a headset wrapped around her ear and a keyboard that clicked too fast. I gave her my name and she smiled politely, offered me water, then motioned for me to have a seat. The waiting room was quiet, filled with the faint scent of lemon polish and legal paper. I sat near the window and looked out at the parking lot while the minutes passed slowly. My hands rested in my lap, clasped, calm on the outside, but my chest carried a current of something deeper, resolve edged with hurt. The lawyer's office was lined with books, thick and heavy, spines faded from years of use. His name was Mark Whitman, a man I had met once before, briefly, when Ted was still alive. He was in his late 50s now, with salt and pepper hair and glasses that he took off as I entered. He didn't speak right away, just motioned for me to sit and waited with a kind of patience I hadn't encountered in a long time. Not the kind that expects you to open up, but the kind that offers space until you're ready. I handed him the folder Josh had left on my table. I had re-stapled it carefully, added a few notes on sticky tabs, and slipped a sheet of paper into the front with my own questions. It felt strange to see it leave my hands, even if just across a desk, like surrendering a piece of a story that no longer belonged to me. He didn't interrupt as he read. He flipped through the pages with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen 100 variations of this kind of thing. I watched his eyes as they moved, the subtle narrowing of his brow at certain phrases, the quick inhalation when he reached the power of attorney draft. He said nothing until he had read the final page. Then he looked at me and nodded. A simple gesture, and in that moment I understood more than any words could have told me. I explained everything then, methodically, just like I used to explain financial reports at work. I told him about the visits, the sudden attention, the urgency in Josh's voice when he said things like streamline and efficiency. I told him I had read every line, that I wasn't confused, that I wasn't afraid of aging, but I was afraid of disappearing into someone else's plan. He listened without scribbling a single note. Only once did he interject, and it was just to clarify a date. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said that I had done the right thing, that this kind of maneuvering was becoming all too common, that families, especially those with assets, even modest ones, often redefined love in legal terms once parents reached a certain age. We talked about options, not just reversing what had been proposed, but reinforcing what I already had. We updated the will, revised the power of attorney with precise language, and established a living trust in my name with clear instructions that no changes could be made without my explicit consent. Every measure was designed to protect me, not from the world, but from those who assumed my silence was agreement. He moved efficiently but never rushed me. After each paragraph, he paused and asked if I understood, and I did. More than that, I appreciated being asked. It felt like reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd given up, the right to be consulted, to be informed, to be in control. When the paperwork was done, he printed copies for me to review at home. He handed them to me in a clean folder, blue this time, with my name typed neatly on the front. It was a small gesture, but I found myself gripping the folder tighter than I expected, as if it contained something more than paper, as if it had weight. As I stood to leave, he asked one final question. He wanted to know if I planned to tell Josh about the changes. I didn't answer right away. I stared down at the folder, then out the window at the world that seemed to move without notice of what had just happened in this small, quiet room. I said I didn't know yet, that I wasn't sure it mattered. He didn't press me. He just nodded and said he'd be available if I needed anything else. He didn't smile, didn't offer platitudes. He simply stood, held the door open, and let me walk out on my own terms. The drive home was long, but not heavy. The sun sat low on the horizon, and the air had begun to cool. I rolled down the window slightly and let the wind move through the car. It felt good, sharp, clean, alive. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked just as it always had. Familiar, still. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't guarding myself anymore. I was owning myself. And in the silence of my home, that felt like power. The house felt different after I got back from the lawyer's office. Not because anything had changed physically. Every photo was still in its frame, every cushion still in place, every room still scented faintly with lavender and lemon polish. But because I had changed, I walked through the front door with a folder in my hand and something solid in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years, not just confidence, ownership, not of the property, but of myself. I set the folder on the dining table and made myself a cup of tea, moving slowly, deliberately, like every step was part of a ritual. The spoon clinked gently against the side of the mug, and the steam rose in quiet swirls. I sat by the window and stared out at the garden. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold. I watched the shadows shift on the fence, the breeze catching the branches. The world didn't know what I had done that day, but I did. I took the rest of the evening to organize everything. I retrieved the old fireproof safe from the hall closet, the one Ted had bolted to the floor after our neighbor's house was broken into 20 years ago. I cleaned out expired documents, old insurance letters, and receipts that no longer meant anything. I replaced them with the new paperwork, my will, the revised power of attorney, the living trust, the deed confirming the house remained in my name. Everything was labeled, everything was current, everything was mine. Then I changed the passwords to all of my accounts, the bank, the mortgage company, the insurance portal. I updated security questions, enabled two-factor authentication, wrote everything down in a little black notebook I hid inside the desk drawer under a false bottom. I removed Josh as an authorized user on the checking account, something I had allowed years ago, just in case. That phrase had echoed in my head lately, taunting me. Just in case I needed help. Just in case I couldn't manage. Just in case I stopped being me. Well, I hadn't. Not yet. And until that time came, if it ever came, I would remain the only person with keys to the life I had built. That night, I slept better than I had in months. There was no anxiety pressing into my ribs, no dreams full of unfinished conversations or worried faces, just rest. When I woke the next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper and a bowl of oatmeal, the same routine I had kept for years. But something was different. I felt taller in my seat. I felt like the silence in the room wasn't empty, but earned. Josh called later that day. I let it go to voicemail. I knew what he wanted, to follow up, to ask if I had reviewed the documents, to push for an answer. I listened to the message only once. He sounded cheerful, practiced. He said he hoped I was doing well, that he wanted to circle back on the forms. That phrase made me pause. Circle back, like this was a business deal, a pending transaction waiting to close. as if I were a client, not a mother. I didn't call him back. Instead, I walked through the house and made small repairs. I oiled the hinges on the guest room door, replaced the batteries in the smoke detectors, swept the leaves off the porch. These were the kinds of tasks that once might have seemed trivial, but now they felt like declarations. Every screw tightened, every shelf dusted, every drawer cleaned reminded me that I was still here, still capable, still in charge. In the afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and picked up a new lock for the back gate. It wasn't about security. It was about sovereignty. I changed the lock myself, kneeling in the late October sun, fingers stiff from the chill, but steady. The metal clicked into place with a sound that felt like punctuation, a final period on a chapter that had gone on too long. Inside, I wrote out a list of everything I now controlled, and not just legally. I listed my daily choices, my routines, the people I allowed into my space, the way I spoke to myself. I had spent years accommodating others, shrinking to make room, softening my voice so I wouldn't sound like a burden. That time was over. I wasn't unkind. I was just no longer available for manipulation wrapped in love. As the sun set, I stood in the hallway and looked at the family photos. Me and Ted at the lake, Josh at his graduation, the grandkids building a snowman in my yard. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt clarity. I loved them. I always would. But love without boundaries is not love. It's surrender. The house stood quietly around me, steady and full. Not just a structure of walls and wood, but a record of a life I had shaped with effort, intention, and patience. I had scrubbed its floors with aching knees, painted its walls after long workdays, cooked 1,000 meals in its kitchen. I had cried in its corners and laughed in its rooms. It was mine in more ways than a title could express. And now, for the first time in years, it was mine again, completely, unapologetically, and undeniably under my control. I invited him over on a Sunday afternoon, the same way I always used to. No special occasion, no clues, just a short, simple message. Come by if you have time. I made pie. I knew that would be enough. Josh never passed up pie, especially not the kind I made with tart apples from the tree in the backyard. It was a recipe passed down from my mother, one I had baked every fall since before he could walk. I think part of him still believed that a warm slice in a familiar kitchen could smooth over anything. I cleaned the house that morning, not because I needed to impress him, but because it helped me think. I dusted the baseboards, polished the dining table, opened the windows to let in the cool October air. I set 2 plates on the counter, 2 forks beside them, and folded napkins into neat squares. It wasn't a performance, it was a setting, a stage where I would finally speak the words I had been carrying for weeks. He arrived just after 3, dressed in a polo shirt and slacks like he had come straight from a showing. He hugged me lightly and commented on how good the house smelled. I offered him tea, and he accepted. We made small talk at first. He asked about the garden, about the church book club, about my neighbors. I answered briefly, then gestured toward the table where I had placed a folder. It wasn't his folder this time. It was mine. I could see the shift in his face immediately. His eyes dropped to the folder, then back to mine. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. He waited. I told him I had taken some time to look over the documents he had left. I said I had thought long and hard about everything. Then I told him calmly and without pause that I had signed everything, just not the way he had expected. His jaw tensed, just slightly. He asked what I meant. I explained that I had spoken to a lawyer, that I had updated my will, that I had filed new papers, that I had revoked the old power of attorney and replaced it with one that ensured full protection of my assets on my terms. I said it all with a tone I barely recognized in myself. Firm, measured, final. He sat down. He didn't touch the pie. He asked if I was upset with him. I said no. This wasn't about punishment. This wasn't even about anger. This was about recognition, about boundaries, about ownership, not just of property, but of my life. He asked if I thought he would have done something wrong. I didn't answer that question directly. Instead, I told him what I saw in those papers he gave me, a subtle removal of my autonomy, a quiet reshaping of my future to fit someone else's schedule. I told him that the issue wasn't whether he intended harm. It was that he expected silence, that he had counted on habit, on history, on the years I had spent saying yes. I watched him shrink a little in his seat, not in defeat, but in understanding. He tried to explain. He used words like efficiency and streamline again. He said he was just trying to help, to prepare, but his voice lacked the same polish it once had. It trembled at the edges. He knew I wasn't going to unsign what I'd done. I told him I still loved him. That hadn't changed, but love wasn't the same as compliance. That I had spent a lifetime giving, and that giving wasn't the same as handing myself over. He sat in silence for a long time. I poured more tea. We didn't argue. We didn't raise our voices. It wasn't that kind of meeting. It was quieter than that, sharper, like two people standing on opposite shores of the same river, realizing they had built very different boats. When he finally stood to leave, he didn't reach for the folder. He left it where it sat, unopened. I walked him to the door, and he hesitated there, like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. He just nodded and stepped off the porch into the cooling light of early evening. I watched his car disappear down the street, then closed the door gently behind me. The house felt still again, not empty, just steady. The kind of steady that comes after you've reclaimed something that was always yours. I sat back down at the table and ate my slice of pie alone. The crust was perfect, the apples just tart enough. The silence in the kitchen wasn't lonely. It was earned, and it was mine. After that day, everything went quiet. Josh didn't call for nearly 2 weeks. No texts, no emails, no surprise visits with takeaway coffee and hopeful smiles. At first, the silence felt like a new kind of grief, shapeless, unfamiliar. Not the grief of losing someone, but the grief of realizing they'd expected you to vanish. But then something inside me settled, a stillness that had been waiting its turn for years. I went about my days as I always had. I watered the garden. I attended Sunday service. I reorganized the pantry, alphabetized the spice rack, scrubbed the grout in the bathroom tiles with a toothbrush. I didn't do these things to distract myself. I did them because they were mine. Every task, no matter how small, reaffirmed the truth I had reclaimed. I still ran this house. I still made my own choices, and I still mattered, even if someone else had quietly decided I didn't need to. One afternoon, I stood in the backyard trimming dead branches from the hydrangeas. The sun was low, painting long shadows across the lawn. I looked at the fence, weathered, gray, sturdy, and I thought about the invisible fences we draw with people, the ones we pretend aren't there until someone crosses them. I realized then that I hadn't drawn enough of them in my life. Or if I had, I'd let others step over them with a smile and a hug and justifications disguised as love. But not anymore. From that point on, I drew my boundary line clearly, not in anger, but in clarity. It didn't mean locking my heart or shutting people out. It meant protecting the parts of me I'd handed away too easily. I stopped answering calls I didn't want to take. I said no when I didn't feel like saying yes. I gave my time only when it felt like an offering, not an obligation. When Josh finally did call, it was late on a Thursday. The leaves outside had started to turn, and the air carried that scent of dried grass and coming frost. His name flashed on the screen, and I stared at it for a few moments before answering. His voice was tentative, less smooth than usual. He asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. The space between us was unmistakable, clean, honest, and unbridgeable for the moment. And I think he felt it too. He didn't bring up the papers. He didn't bring up the lawyer. He didn't try to reverse the shift. Instead, he asked about the garden, the grandkids. He told me about work in short, general phrases. I listened, but I didn't offer much. I didn't fill the silence like I used to. He said he'd try to come by next weekend. I said, maybe, and I meant it. After we hung up, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I felt grounded. Drawing that line hadn't severed the relationship. It had simply redrawn it, reframed it. I could still be his mother. I could still love him. But I didn't have to give myself away to prove it. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had once almost signed my name away. I lit a small candle. The room was warm, the kind of warmth that came from within, not from anything external. I picked up a pen, not to sign, but to write. I opened my notebook and wrote a simple sentence at the top of a fresh page. I am not a placeholder in someone else's plan. I underlined it twice. I didn't write anything else that night. I didn't have to. That one sentence was enough. It was a marker, a flag, a fence post, a reminder that boundaries weren't walls. They were definitions, and I was no longer afraid to define myself. The next morning, I stood at the kitchen sink, looking out at the yard. The first leaf had fallen from the maple tree, a small red shape resting on the grass. I smiled to myself. Change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it lands like a whisper. And when it does, the world finally begins to feel like your own again. The first frost came earlier than expected that year. I woke to a thin shimmer of white across the lawn, the grass stiff under the morning sun, every leaf edged in ice. I stood at the window with my cup of coffee wrapped in both hands and watched as the light turned everything silver. It was the kind of stillness that asked nothing of you, the kind that allowed you to simply exist. By then, things had settled, not back to how they were before. No, that door had closed quietly and firmly, but into something new, something quieter and stronger. Josh and I spoke occasionally, brief calls, surface-level updates. He came by once to drop off a box of his old books he wanted me to donate. He stood on the porch longer than necessary, as if hoping I might invite him in. I didn't, not out of spite, just out of honesty. The boundary remained, not rigid, but real. I had stopped waiting for apologies. I didn't need them anymore. What I needed was space to feel whole again, and I had carved it out, inch by inch, moment by moment. I spent more time outside. I took long walks down the quiet streets of my neighborhood, breathing deeply, noticing things I had missed for years. The rustle of squirrels in dry leaves, the sound of wind moving through power lines, the distant hum of a train at night. The world was full of subtle details that belonged only to me. The house had never felt more like mine, not just in legal terms, but in spirit. I had repainted the bedroom, soft green, the color of calm. I replaced the curtains in the guest room. I rearranged the bookshelves in the living room, placing my favorite titles at eye level, giving them the place they deserved. These were small changes, but each one felt like a reclamation. I was no longer preserving a space for someone else's future. I was living in it fully, presently. I started journaling again, not every day, not as therapy, but as a form of presence. I wrote about what I noticed. The way the morning sun fell through the kitchen window, the weight of a cool mug in my hands, the rhythm of my own breath as I moved through the house. I didn't write about Josh often. When I did, it was without anger. I didn't need to unpack him anymore. I just needed to remember who I was before everything narrowed into being his mother. There were days I missed him. Or at least I missed the idea of us, the version of our relationship I had hoped for. But I knew the difference now between longing and regret. Longing is soft. Regret is corrosive. I let the longing pass through me without trying to fix it. I let it be what it was. One evening, I opened the safe and pulled out the folder with all my updated documents. I sat at the kitchen table and flipped through each page slowly. My name was there, my signature, my choices. Everything had been reviewed, approved, notarized, filed. Everything was exactly as I wanted it. There was a certain power in that. Not the loud kind that announces itself, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing nothing can be taken from you without your permission. It wasn't just about legal security, it was about self-trust. I had protected myself not out of fear, but out of certainty. I had moved through doubt, through guilt, through love and memory, and the aching desire to be seen. And I had landed here in a home that bore my name, here in a life where I no longer apologized for drawing lines, here where I could sit in silence and feel not forgotten, but fulfilled. The pie dish on the counter was empty, a slice eaten earlier with a book in one hand, the fire crackling nearby. The chair across from me was empty too, and I was at peace with that. I didn't need someone sitting there to know that I mattered. I had spent a lifetime nurturing others. Now I had begun nurturing myself. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I lit a candle and watched the flame flicker. It was small, steady, resilient, just like me. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands over the folder, and smiled. Not because something had been won, but because something had finally been reclaimed. My life, my story, my name, all of it, now and always in my hands.